The collector's hand closed around my wrist hard enough to bruise, and the first thing I thought, the only thing, in that half second before fear caught up with me, was that his watch was a fake. Wrong weight on the second hand. Cheap movement dressed up in stolen gold. Some part of my brain would always do that, count and calculate, and correct, even with my daughter's fingers digging crescents into my coat sleeve 6 feet away. 6,240, Garrick Voss said, like he was reading a grocery list instead of a threat. Plus the vig. You know how this works, Josie. I knew how it worked. I had known for 14 months, since the funeral home called about the balance on the casket and I signed a piece of paper I shouldn't have signed, because grief makes you stupid and desperate at the same time. Fairhaven Lending had seemed like a normal loan company in October. By December, it had a name that made checkout clerks flinch when I mentioned it. I paid $400 last week, I said. I have the receipt. Interest doesn't care about receipts. His smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Maybe we talk about the kids' college fund instead. Save some time. Wren made a small sound behind me, not quite a word. I felt it in my spine before I heard it, the particular vibration of my daughter deciding to be brave in a way 6-year-olds should never have to be. "Leave my mom alone," she said, too loud, too high, and stepped in front of me with her stuffed fox clutched against her chest like a shield made of orange fur and one crooked hand-stitched eye. Garrick laughed, and that was the sound that broke something loose in her. She bolted, not away from him, past him, into the plaza crowd, dodging a stroller and a man with a coffee cart, and I screamed her name and lunged after her, and the collector's grip tightened on my arm, like he'd decided I was the one worth keeping. She didn't stop running until she hit something solid. A woman. Tall, dark coat, standing utterly still at the edge of the fountain like she'd been carved there, and just hadn't gotten around to moving yet. "Mom," Wren shouted, grabbing 2 fistfuls of expensive black wool. "Mom, that man is scaring us." I would spend a long time afterward trying to explain, to myself and later to other people, why a 6-year-old picked a stranger's coat out of a crowd of 40 coats and called her mother. Wren would only ever say the woman looked like someone who wouldn't run. She wasn't wrong. The stranger looked down, pale eyes, unhurried, the kind of stillness that made the air around her feel 2 degrees colder. Then she looked up, past Wren, straight at Garrick Voss, and something in her face rearranged itself into a calm that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Is there a problem?" she said. Not a question. A verdict, waiting to be handed down. I did not know yet that the entire city called her Winter, that boardrooms went quiet when she walked in 12 minutes late on purpose, that men twice her size had learned not to raise their voices in her presence. I only knew that Garrick Voss let go of my wrist like it had caught fire, and that the woman my daughter had just claimed as her mother did not correct her. Not once. Not yet. "No problem," Garrick said, already backing toward the parking structure. "We'll finish this later, Josie." "We won't," the woman said, and her voice didn't rise at all, and somehow that was worse for him than shouting would have been. He left. My knees discovered, belatedly, that they were made of something less reliable than bone. The stranger caught my elbow before I fully understood I was falling, and up close I registered the smell of her, vetiver and something like cold glass, clean and sharp, the opposite of every overheated, overcrowded room I'd stood in that year. My own daughter was still gripping her coat with both hands, breathing too fast, and the woman had one palm resting light against Wren's back, like she'd been doing it for years instead of 90 seconds. "You don't have to keep holding on," the woman told her, gently, "but you can if you want to." Wren held on. I opened my mouth to apologize, to explain, to gather my daughter, and disappear before this stranger asked the obvious question, "Why is your 6-year-old calling me mom?" And instead what came out was smaller and truer than anything I'd planned to say. "Thank you," I said. "I'm so sorry." She's never done that before. The woman's gaze moved from Wren's white-knuckled fists to my bruising wrist to my face, cataloging something, filing it away behind eyes the color of a sky before snow. "My name is Vesper Eshkam," she said. "Sit down before you fall down. Then you can tell me who that man was and why he thinks he owns you." I did not know it yet, but I had just met the only person in 14 months who was going to ask that question and actually wait for the answer. The coffee shop she led us to had no prices on the menu, which was its own kind of warning, but she ordered hot chocolate for Wren without asking, and black coffee for herself, and, after a beat that felt like she was recalibrating something, tea for me instead of coffee. Because my hands were shaking too hard to trust with a full cup. I noticed that. I noticed everything about her, the way you notice the exits in a room after the year I'd had. "Start with his name," she said. Once Wren was occupied dunking a spoon in whipped cream, like it was the most important scientific work of her life. Garrick Voss. He collects for a company called Fairhaven Lending. I turned my mug in a slow circle. My wife took out a loan when she was sick. I've been paying it off since she died. I thought I was almost done. How much is left? 6,240. Before whatever they're adding today. Something crossed her face, there and gone, quick as a held breath. She didn't ask the obvious follow-up, "Why don't you go to the police? Why don't you get a lawyer?" Because a woman like her already knew the answer. People like Garrick Voss didn't exist without people protecting them. "May I see the paperwork?" she said. "If you have it with you." I did, because I carried it everywhere. The way you carry a wound you're afraid will get worse if you stop checking on it. I slid the folded loan agreement across the table more out of exhaustion than hope. She scanned it fast, the way people scan things they've been trained to read at speed, and then went still in a different way than before. "The interest calculation on page 3 is wrong," I said before I could stop myself. "Old habits, older reflexes. It compounds daily against a contract that specifies monthly. They've been overcharging her, us, by roughly 11% since March." She looked up. "You did that math in your head just now. I used to do it for a living." I hadn't meant to say that either. It came out of the same place the thank you had, some door in me she'd knocked without meaning to. Forensic accounting. Before what? Before it stopped mattering what I was good at. I nodded toward Wren, who had whipped cream on her nose and was narrating an elaborate story to her fox about defeating a dragon. Some jobs don't come with childcare that starts before 6 a.m. Vesper Ashkam looked at the loan document again, then at me, and I watched her build something behind her eyes, brick by brick, the way I imagined she built everything. A decision she wasn't going to say out loud until it was already finished. "I have a company," she said. "Somebody has been moving money through it that I cannot explain, and 3 auditors I've paid a great deal of money have told me nothing useful. I need someone who reads numbers the way you just read that page. I can pay you enough to make Garrick Voss a very small, very solvable problem. You don't know me. I know you stepped in front of your daughter before you thought about it. I know you can spot fraud in 11 seconds without a calculator." Her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the ghost of one visiting briefly. "I know your daughter called me mom to a strange woman in a public plaza because some instinct in her decided I was safer than the alternative. Children are rarely wrong about that. I'd like to prove her right." I should have said no. I would spend the next 10 months turning that moment over and over, the version of my life where I thanked her, took her card, and walked away to keep surviving quietly on my own terms. Instead, I looked at my daughter, sticky-faced and safe for the first time in weeks, and said the only thing that made any sense. When do I start? Ashcombe Tower rose 60 floors above a city that had learned to speak of it in a hush, all glass and pale stone, a building that looked less constructed than grown, the way glaciers look grown. My daughter counted the floors out loud on the elevator ride up, and by the time we reached the 40th, she had run out of numbers she trusted and simply said, "This is a lot of building for one person." It was. I would learn, slowly, that Vesper Ashcombe rattled around all 60 floors of her own company like a woman haunting a house she'd built specifically so no one else could get comfortable in it. Her assistant, a sharp-suited beta named Priscilla, with a smile like a paper cut, looked at my coat, the good one, the one with the mended cuff, and then at my shoes, and did not bother hiding the arithmetic she was doing about how I'd ended up on this floor. "Ms. Ashcombe doesn't usually take personal interest projects," Priscilla said, handing me a badge with my photo already printed on it, taken from some camera I hadn't noticed. "I'm sure you'll want to make the most of it." I smiled at her the way you smile at weather you can't control. I'll try not to disappoint anyone's expectations of how quickly I fail. That earned the first real laugh I'd heard out of the girl who ran the corner desk outside Vesper's office, a boy named Theo, who slid me a coffee without asking and said, "Lo, she hasn't hired anyone in 3 years except contractors she fires within a month." You must have said something interesting. I hadn't said anything interesting. I had said the truth, and apparently truth was rare enough in that building to count as strategy. The work itself came easily, in the way water finds the crack in a foundation. 3 days in, I found the first irregularity, a shell vendor account skimming rounding errors off supplier payments, pennies at a time, thousands of transactions, the kind of fraud built to survive a normal audit because no single number looked wrong. I flagged it and moved on to the next account, and the next, building a map of small wounds across the company's ledgers that all bled, eventually, toward the same handful of accounts. Vesper found me at my desk on the 9th night, long after Priscilla and Theo had gone home. Long after Wren had fallen asleep in the reading nook I'd been allowed to set up for her, because there was no one at home to watch her, and no one here seemed inclined to mind. "You're still here," she said. "So are you." I didn't look up from the spreadsheet. I found something. 3 vendors, all registered to addresses that don't exist, all approved by the same signature. She came around the desk to look, close enough that I caught the vetiver and glass of her again, close enough that the warmth radiating off her skin registered somewhere low in my chest before my brain caught up and named it. She didn't touch me. She rested one hand on the back of my chair instead, careful, deliberate. A woman testing the temperature of water she wasn't sure she was allowed into. "Whose signature?" she asked. I told her. She went quiet in a way I was starting to recognize, the stillness of someone doing violence to their own composure rather than let it show. "Desmond Price," she said finally. "My chief financial officer. My father hired him. I could be wrong. You're not wrong." She straightened, and the warmth of her retreated with the movement, leaving a colder version of the air behind. "Keep going. Quietly, tell no one but me." "Okay," I hesitated, then said the thing I'd been carrying since the coffee shop. "Thank you for what you did, not just the job, the plaza." "Your daughter called me Mom," Vesper said, and something moved behind her eyes I couldn't yet read. I find I don't mind being asked to live up to that. Wren stirred awake in the reading nook a moment later, rubbing her eyes, Fox tucked under one arm, and said, with the terrifying honesty of small children everywhere. Are we staying here forever? Vesper looked at her for a long moment. Not forever, she said, but longer than tonight, if your mother will let me feed you both first. I said yes before I'd finished deciding to. It would become a pattern. Desmond Price found me alone in the records archive on the 17th day, in the gray hour before the building filled up, and he did not raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. You've been busy, he said, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, like a man who'd rehearsed looking relaxed. Digging through vendor files that aren't yours to dig through. Miss Ashcombe asked me to review the accounts. Miss Ashcombe hired a cleaning woman's assistant off the street because her heart got tangled up with a sob story in a plaza. His smile stayed pleasant the whole time, which was its own kind of threat. I've been with this company 19 years. I built half of what makes it function. I'd think carefully, if I were you, about which of us she keeps when this stops being charming. I kept my voice level, the way I'd learned to when Garrick Voss stood too close and wanted me rattled. I only report what the numbers say. Numbers can say a great deal of things, depending on who's arranging them. He turned to go, then paused, and delivered the rest almost gently, which was somehow the cruelest part. It would be a shame if something happened to unsettle your little arrangement. Children get taken from unstable homes all the time. I imagine a single mother with debt to a man like Garrick Voss would look very unstable, on paper. He left before I could answer, and I stood very still in the archive, with my heart slamming against my ribs, because I understood, with sudden and total clarity, that Desmond Price and Garrick Voss were not two separate storms. They were the same weather system, wearing two different coats. I told Vesper that night, in her office, with the city lit up gold and merciless behind her. Price threatened you, she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice had dropped into the register I'd started to think of as pre-storm, quiet enough to be mistaken for calm by anyone who hadn't watched her face while she said it. He implied a lot of things. That's the kind of man he is. I wrapped my arms around myself. He also implied he knows Garrick Voss isn't a coincidence. He isn't. Vesper crossed to the window, hands loose at her sides in a way that took visible effort. Fairhaven Lending has been quietly folding into 3 of the shell accounts you flagged. If Price is laundering embezzled funds through predatory loans, then he built the debt collector who cornered you in that plaza. Your wife's loan wasn't bad luck, Josie. It was bait for someone who could be controlled. The floor tilted under me in a way it hadn't since the funeral. He targeted us. I don't yet know if he targeted you specifically, or if your wife was simply unlucky enough to need money at the wrong company. Vesper turned, and her expression had gone somewhere colder and more focused than I'd seen it go before, a woman assembling a war she hadn't wanted to fight. But I intend to find out, and when I do, he will not survive it professionally or otherwise if he's foolish enough to make it personal. Vesper, I said her name for the first time without a title in front of it, and she went still at the sound of it in a way that told me she'd noticed too. If this gets dangerous, it already is. She crossed the room, stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I had to tip my head back to hold her gaze. I am not going to pretend otherwise to make you feel better. But I will tell you this. Whatever happens, you and Wren are not facing it from a plaza fountain anymore. You're facing it from inside these walls. That is not nothing. It wasn't nothing. It was, in fact, the first time in 14 months I'd felt something other than braced for impact, and I didn't know what to do with the strange, dangerous relief of it, standing that close to a woman the whole city called Winter, while she looked at me like I was the only warm thing in the room. The break-in happened on a Tuesday at 2:47 in the morning, and I counted every one of the 11 seconds it took me to understand the sound at my apartment door wasn't the pipes. Wren was awake before I reached her room, sitting bolt upright with Ember clutched to her chest, eyes huge in the dark. "Mama," she whispered, "the old title, the true one. Someone's trying to get in." I got her into the closet with my body between her and the door and my phone in my shaking hand, and the only number I dialed, the only name in the entire directory that meant safety, was Vesper's. "Someone's at my apartment," I breathed. "Wren's scared." "I don't. Lock yourselves in the bathroom. I'm 9 minutes out." "Stay on the line." She talked to me the entire 9 minutes, low and even, asking Wren's favorite color, asking what Ember's favorite food was, keeping two frightened people tethered to a voice instead of a fear. And when the lock finally splintered and a shape moved through my apartment, I heard, distantly, sirens that hadn't been there 30 seconds before. And then Vesper's voice, no longer on the phone, but in the hallway, sharp as a blade unsheathed. "Touch that door again, and it will be the last thing you touch with that hand." Garrick Voss did not touch the door again. By the time the police arrived, he was face down on my hallway carpet, with Vesper Eshcombe's knee between his shoulder blades and an expression on her face I hoped, fervently, never to be on the receiving end of. She drove us to her house that night, an old stone place outside the city with ivy on the east wall and a housekeeper named Nan, who took one look at Wren's pale face and produced hot milk and honey like she'd been expecting us for years. She put us in adjoining rooms without being asked and told Wren, with total conviction, that nothing in this house had ever once let a child down. I found Vesper on the terrace afterward, staring at nothing, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she wasn't drinking. "You didn't have to come yourself," I said. "You could have sent security." I did not want to send security. She didn't look at me. I wanted to be the one who came. "Why?" She turned then, and whatever composure she usually wore like armor had slipped, just slightly. Just enough that I saw the woman underneath it, tired, frightened in a way she probably hadn't let herself be frightened in years, looking at me like I was a question she hadn't finished answering. "Because when your daughter called me Mom in that plaza, something in me answered before I told it to," she said. "I have spent every day since trying to decide whether that terrifies me more than it should. It does. I want you to know that. And I am telling you anyway. Vesper, you don't have to say anything." Her voice had gone rough at the edges. "I only needed you to know. I want to say something." My heart was a fist against my ribs. "I want to say it, but I need you to tell me you understand what you'd be choosing. A woman with debt and a dead wife and a child who already calls you by a title you haven't earned yet." "She didn't call me a title," Vesper said. "She called me safe. I intend to spend the rest of my life earning it properly, if you'll let me try." "Tell me to stop," I said, closing the distance between us. "And I will." "Don't stop," she said, and I didn't. The kiss was slow and careful and tasted faintly of the honeyed milk from the kitchen, and somewhere behind us, Nan's voice called softly that the children's rooms were ready, using the word children before either of us had claimed it, and neither of us corrected her. The house folded around us the way houses do when they've been waiting for people to fill them. I learned over the following weeks that Vesper Eshcombe took her coffee black and her toast burnt on purpose, a habit she wouldn't explain until the fourth night, when we sat on the kitchen floor at midnight because Wren had a fever and neither of us trusted the thermometer's first reading. "My mother burned toast," Vesper said, watching Wren sleep against my shoulder, flushed and finally cool enough to breathe easy. "Every morning. My father called it wasteful. She kept doing it anyway, until she stopped doing anything at all. What happened to her? She was an omega who married into a family that considered warmth a weakness to be trained out of a person. Vesper's jaw tightened. He succeeded, eventually, not with cruelty you could point to, with small denials. A door closed here, a dinner eaten alone there. By the time I was 12, she'd stopped burning the toast. A pause. I burn mine now. I don't know why I started. I think some part of me is still trying to bring her back to the table. I reached over and covered her hand with mine, careful of Wren's sleeping weight between us. That's not weakness. I used to think it was. She turned her hand over, laced her fingers through mine. I built this entire company on the theory that control was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you. I was very good at it. I was also, I am beginning to understand, very alone. Tell me about her. Elena. Vesper said it like she was asking permission to walk somewhere painful. So I did. The burnt pancakes on Sundays, worse than any burnt toast. Batter never quite cooked through because Elena refused to follow a timer, insisting love couldn't be measured in minutes. The saying she left behind, the one I still whispered to Wren at bedtime, leave a light on, and I'll always find my way back to you. I told Vesper about the diagnosis, the 18 months, the loan I signed with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, the exact shape of the hole a person leaves when they go. I'm not trying to replace her, Vesper said quietly when I finished. I want you to know that. Whatever this becomes. I know. I rested my head against the cabinet behind us, exhausted in the particular, bottomless way of a night spent afraid for your child. The light's already on, Vesper. It has been since the plaza. I just didn't know what I was leaving it on for. Odette Rourke, Vesper's head of security, arrived the next morning with a look on her face that suggested she'd spent 15 years perfecting the art of disapproving silently, and handed Wren a small wooden fox carved so precisely it might have been Ember's twin, if Ember had been carved instead of stitched. In case the other one ever needs a friend, Odette said gruffly, refusing to meet my eyes, which was how I understood it wasn't really about the fox. You made this? I asked. I whittle when I'm angry. I've been angry a great deal, watching men like Garrick Voss walk streets they shouldn't. She straightened, all business again. I've worked for this family 15 years. I have never once seen her wait for anyone the way she waited outside that hospital room 3 nights ago while your girl's fever broke. Take care of that, if you're going to take it. I promised her I would. I meant it in a way that scared me a little, the way promises do when you've learned the hard way what it costs to break them. The peace lasted 11 days. It ended with a text from Priscilla, sent at 6:04 in the morning while I was making Wren's lunch. Press is running a story. You need to see this before Miss Ashcombe does. The headline, when I found it, made my stomach drop through the floor. Winter's charity case. Sources say Ashcombe CEO staging fake family to soften public image amid fraud probe. Anonymous sources. Details only someone inside the company could have known. My late wife's name, the exact balance of my debt, a photograph of Wren at school pickup that no reporter should have had access to. I called the school before I finished reading it, some animal instinct screaming louder than logic, and the woman who answered told me, in the too careful voice of someone delivering news she'd been trained to deliver gently, that Wren's grandmother had already picked her up 20 minutes ago. She doesn't have a grandmother, I said, and the floor of the world went out from under me entirely. I don't remember the drive to the school. I remember the crossing guard's face when I asked her to describe the woman, and I remember, with a clarity that will stay with me the rest of my life, finding Ember lying in the gutter by the pickup curb, one stitched eye staring up at nothing. dropped in what could only have been a struggle too small and too fast for anyone to stop. I stood on that sidewalk holding my daughter's fox and understood, in the emptiest way a person can understand anything, that Garrick Voss had come back to collect the only currency I had left. Vesper reached the school 4 minutes after I called her, and whatever calm she'd shown the plaza, whatever composure had carried her through every crisis since, none of it survived the sight of that empty curb. She went a color I hadn't seen on her before, something past pale, something closer to stone. "Where?" she said, and it wasn't a question so much as a demand the universe owed her an answer to. "I don't know. I don't know, Vesper. They took her. They took my voice broke apart entirely. The fox. They left the fox." She took it from my hands, turned it over once like it might tell her something, then closed her fist around it hard enough that her knuckles went white. "Price needs leverage before the board meeting Thursday," she said, thinking out loud, fast, the fear in her repurposed instantly into something with edges. "He knows I'll hand over anything to get her back. This isn't random. This is a trade he intends to offer. Then we make the trade." I would have signed anything in that moment, burned anything, handed over every document I'd ever compiled. "No," Vesper's voice cracked like a whip and then gentled just as fast, her hand closing around my shoulder. "No, because the moment he has what he wants, there's no reason left for him to give her back safely. We don't negotiate with him. We find her before Thursday, and we take her, and then we bury him so completely he never gets to threaten anyone again." I looked at her, this woman the papers called Winter, watching her rebuild herself in real time out of fear and fury and something that looked unmistakably like love wearing armor. "How?" I said. "You're the one who reads the numbers no one else can see." She pressed the fox back into my hands. Fairhaven Lending has to hold collateral somewhere. Warehouses, storage, somewhere off the books, paid for in the same laundered cash you've been tracking for weeks. Find me the address, Josie. I'll handle the rest. I sat down at her kitchen table 2 hours later with 3 years of transaction records and the particular, terrible focus that grief and fury lend a mind built for patterns, and I found it. A storage facility on the industrial edge of the River District, leased under a shell company that traced, through 4 false names and 1 careless rounding error, directly back to Desmond Price. "There," I said, sliding the address across to Vesper and Odette. Unit 14, paid in cash every month for 6 years. Odette was already moving toward the door, radio in hand, calling in favors from people who owed her favors. Vesper caught my hand before I could follow. "You're staying here," she said. "She's my daughter, and if something happens to you, she has no one." Vesper's grip tightened, not unkind, just immovable. "I am not asking you to trust a stranger with this. I am asking you to trust me. I will bring her home." I searched her face for any sign of the composed, untouchable CEO the city feared, and found none of her left in it at all. Only a woman who had, somewhere in the last 2 months, without either of us quite naming it, decided that my daughter's safety was hers to guarantee. "Bring her home," I said. "Please, I promise you," Vesper said, already turning for the door, ember still crushed in her fist like a talisman. "The light's already on. I'm not leaving it unanswered." The warehouse smelled like motor oil and old cardboard, and Wren was exactly where the numbers said she'd be, Unit 14, tied to a folding chair with a length of rope too loose to have been tied by someone who did this often. Tears dried on her face, but her chin lifted in the particular stubborn set I recognized from every photograph I had of Elena. Vesper told me all of it later, in pieces, because I wasn't there for the worst of it, and I have never decided whether that mercy was for my sake or hers. Garrick Voss hadn't expected Odette's team to arrive with a warrant that a very motivated district attorney's office had rushed through in 90 minutes flat, once Vesper explained precisely whose signature was on the shell company's paperwork. He hadn't expected Vesper Ashcombe herself to be first through the door, either, moving faster than a woman that composed had any business moving. He grabbed a length of pipe from a shelf when he saw her coming and swung it toward Wren's chair, not to hit the girl, Odette said afterward, more like a man lashing out at the nearest solid object between himself and consequences. And Vesper put her own body between the pipe and my daughter without a single second of hesitation, taking the blow across her forearm with a crack that Odette said she heard from the loading door. Vesper did not go down. She caught the pipe on the second swing with her bare hand, wrenched it free, and for 3 full seconds, Odette counted them. Later, unprompted, like she needed someone to know exactly how close it had come. Looked like a woman capable of doing something that couldn't be undone. Vesper, my daughter's voice, small and steady in the middle of all of it. Don't. She's watching. Not me. Wren meant herself, 6 years old, tied to a chair, and she was the one who reached through the violence and pulled Vesper Ashcombe back from the edge of becoming exactly the kind of person she'd spent her whole life refusing to become. Vesper set the pipe down, stepped back, let Odette's people take Garrick Voss to the ground instead, cuffed and shouting things that would matter a great deal in a courtroom 11 weeks later. "Nobody's coming for people like you," he spat at me, later through the back window of the patrol car, and I looked at Vesper standing beside me with a fractured arm in a makeshift sling, and my daughter asleep against her uninjured shoulder, and I found I had an answer after all. "Someone came," I said. "You're just the only one surprised by it." The board meeting happened Thursday morning as scheduled, because Vesper Ashcombe did not believe in giving men like Desmond Price the courtesy of extra time to prepare a defense. She stood at the head of the long glass table, with her arm in a sling and 11 months of forensic work laid out on the screen behind her, and she let me deliver the numbers myself, in front of every executive who had ever looked at me like a charity case in the wrong coat. 3 shell vendors, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Registered to non-existent addresses, approved exclusively by Desmond Price's signature. The funds route through a laundering network operating as Fairhaven Lending, a predatory loan company that has been targeting grieving families for 6 years, including my own. Price's face had gone the color of old paper. This is a fabrication. A grief-stricken woman with a grudge, coached by. The rounding errors are consistent to the decimal across 412 transactions, I said over him, because I had earned that, and I was done being spoken over by men who mistook my quiet for weakness. Fraud that precise isn't grief. It's arithmetic. Yours. Vesper let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then she looked around the table at every executive who had smiled thinly at me in hallways for 2 months and said, in the voice the whole city had learned to fear, Desmond Price is terminated, effective immediately, and this board will be fully cooperating with the district attorney's office. I would also like it noted, for the record, that the woman who found this fraud was hired off a street corner because I recognized competence when I saw it, and every one of you failed to notice it walking past your offices for 2 months. Price was arrested before he cleared the lobby. Garrick Voss, facing kidnapping and assault charges with no company left to protect him, gave a statement naming every account Price had ever asked him to intimidate on behalf of, and Fairhaven Lending closed its doors within the week, its remaining debts, including mine, including 41 others just like mine, voided by court order. That night, Vesper found me on the terrace where she'd first told me the truth about her mother, and this time there was nothing left standing between us. No threat, no debt, No locked door. I have something to ask you, she said, and I need you to know you can say no. I know. The bond isn't something I take lightly. It isn't a metaphor for us. It changes things, permanently, in ways that can't be undone. Her hand found mine, careful, deliberate, the way it always was when the stakes mattered most. I am asking anyway, because I have spent my whole life believing love was a weakness bred out of people like my mother, and you have spent 2 months proving to me, every single day, that it might be the only strength that's ever mattered. Ask me properly, I said, my heart in my throat. Josie Lark. She lifted my hand to her lips, so gentle it undid me more than any grand gesture could have. May I claim you? Fully bond and bite and everything after, for as long as you'll have me. Tell me to stop, and I will, I said, echoing the words she'd given me months before on this same terrace, and watched her smile, real, unguarded, a smile the city had never once been allowed to see. Don't stop, she said. Her mouth found the curve of my neck, and she paused there, lips against my pulse, waiting. Ask me with your words, I whispered. May I? Yes, I turned my head to give her better access, offering the answer with my whole body. Yes, Vesper, always yes. The bite, when it came, was not pain so much as a door swinging open somewhere behind my ribs, a channel humming to life between us that let me feel, for the first time, the exact shape of what she'd been carrying alone for 34 years, the loneliness, the discipline, the terror of being loved and losing it again. And, underneath all of it, brighter than any of it, what she felt for me now, warm and certain and entirely without doubt. Somewhere in the house, Wren shrieked with delight over something Nan had let her watch too late at night, and neither of us moved to stop her. The wedding happened on the terrace in early spring, small enough to fit in one photograph, which was exactly what Vesper had wanted. Odette stood at the back in her only suit, arms crossed, visibly fighting the urge to look moved and losing. Nan cried through the entire thing and blamed it on pollen. Frankie, my oldest friend, gave a toast that made Vesper laugh so hard she had to set her glass down, and Theo from the front desk brought a cake he'd baked himself, slightly burnt at the edges, which he swore was an accident and which made Vesper go quiet and hold my hand a little tighter under the table. Wren stood between us at the altar in a green dress she'd chosen herself, holding both our hands, and when the officiant asked if anyone objected, she said, loudly and with tremendous authority, I don't. I called it first, anyway, which got the only laugh of the entire ceremony that mattered. Our vows were short. Vespers included the line I'd been waiting 11 months to hear her say out loud, in front of witnesses, without armor. I promise you, she said, holding both my hands, the lights already on. It always will be. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving that to you, one burnt piece of toast at a time. A year later, almost to the day, Desmond Price was sentenced to 11 years for fraud and conspiracy. Garrick Voss, who had cooperated fully, served 18 months and, according to the last update Odette passed along with grim satisfaction, was working construction upstate and had not been seen within 100 miles of anyone he'd once threatened. Fairhaven Lending's assets were liquidated and redistributed to its victims, mine included, down to the exact overcharged cent I'd once caught on page 3 of a contract that had started everything. We got a dog that spring, a scruffy, oversized mutt wren named Pancake, after the tradition Vesper had finally learned properly from Nan, burning the first 2 batches on purpose before she got the third one right and served it to Wren with a ceremony usually reserved for coronations. Wren asked us, over dinner one evening in early summer, whether a baby might be next, with the blunt confidence of a child who had never once doubted she'd get an honest answer. "Someday," Vesper said, glancing at me, and I saw the whole shape of that someday already forming behind her eyes, patient and certain, the way she built everything that mattered. "When we're ready. We're in no hurry. We have time now. All the time in the world." Odette gave her blessing the only way she knew how, gruffly, over coffee, watching Wren teach the dog to sit in the garden. "In 15 years, she said, I never once saw her wait for anyone. Now I can't get her to leave that girl's side long enough to sign her own mail." She shook her head, but she was smiling. "Take care of what you've got. Both of you did the hard part already." On the last morning of that first summer, I found Ember and Odette's carved twin sitting together on the kitchen windowsill, side by side in the early light, watching over the burnt toast and the coffee and the small chaotic kingdom we'd built out of a plaza, a fountain, and a 6-year-old's desperate courage. Vesper came up behind me and wrapped both arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all, because there was nothing left that needed saying. It turns out, the bravest thing a person can do isn't running toward danger or standing against it. It's letting yourself be seen, fully, by the one person who finally stops long enough to look, and staying, once they do, to build something worth being seen inside of. Some families are born. Ours was claimed on a Tuesday by a girl who ran into the right stranger and refused to let go. The end.